It began on a Friday, October 13th, 1307. Before the sun had risen over Paris, soldiers loyal to King Philip IV stormed commanderies across France. Hundreds of knights, some aged, some battle-scarred, all sworn to God, were dragged from their beds and thrown into chains. They were the Knights Templar, once hailed as the fiercest warriors of Christendom. Now they stood accused of sins so grotesque the charges seemed like madness: spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, secret initiation rites involving kisses in unholy places. Under torture, many confessed. But behind the confessions lurked a deeper, darker truth. The Templars had grown powerful, too powerful. Their network stretched from the battlefields of the Holy Land to the vaults of European monarchs. They answered only to the Pope. They owned castles, fleets, and possibly even secrets kings feared. And they were rich, very rich. That night, it is said their treasure vanished, as did their documents, their relics, everything not nailed to the floor. What happened to it? No one knows, but rumors whispered of ships leaving La Rochelle under cover of darkness and of a curse cast by the last Grandmaster as the flames devoured him. The question remains: how did a brotherhood of warrior monks, born to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, end up burned as heretics and damned in legend? And why, 700 years later, does the mystery still haunt us? In the shadow of the Holy Sepulchre, the year was 1099, and Jerusalem had fallen. After a brutal siege lasting nearly 6 weeks, the First Crusade had achieved its sacred aim. The blood of defenders and pilgrims alike soaked the stones of the Holy City. But at last, the Christian banners flew triumphantly above the dome of the rock. For the first time in centuries, Western Christendom controlled the spiritual heart of their faith. The gates of Jerusalem opened to throngs of pilgrims eager to witness the places where Jesus had walked, preached, and died. The city was alive with faith, hope, and renewed purpose. Yet, beneath the triumph, a harsher reality took root. The roads to Jerusalem, the lifelines for pilgrims, were riddled with danger. Bandits lurked in the rocky hills. Remnants of Islamic forces still fought back fiercely, and the vast deserts and mountain passes challenged even the most seasoned traveler. Pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land often faced robbery, kidnapping, or death. Many who set out in hope never reached their destination. It was in this volatile, lawless space, between spiritual longing and mortal peril, that a new idea took shape, an idea that would birth one of the most enigmatic and powerful military orders in history. In 1119, barely 2 decades after the fall of Jerusalem, a small group of knights gathered quietly, led by a French nobleman named Hugh de Payens. These 9 men shared a bold vision: to create an order of warrior monks dedicated not just to prayer, but to the protection of pilgrims along the treacherous roads. They would bind themselves by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet take up arms as God's soldiers, defending Christendom's sacred trust. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, whose fragile kingdom struggled to maintain control over the captured territories, granted them quarters on the Temple Mount, that most hallowed of places. The site had once housed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but was believed by many Western Christians to be built upon the ruins of Solomon's Temple itself, the biblical heart of ancient Israel's spiritual legacy. From this birthplace came their name: the Poor Fellow, soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a name that sounded humble, yet echoed across centuries. Their early days were marked by stark simplicity and hardship. The knights rode together on a single horse, a testament to their vow of poverty and brotherly solidarity. Their armor was often worn and patched, their weapons modest. They lived on alms and hospitality, often begging from the faithful who saw them as holy protectors. Their seal, famously depicting 2 knights sharing one mount, captured this profound image of sacrifice and unity. It symbolized their commitment to brotherhood and the harsh demands of their mission. However, this was more than a mercenary band or a charitable escort. They embodied a revolutionary idea: melding the monastic life of prayer and discipline with the brutal demands of warfare. Their days were divided between prayer in the chapel, rigorous training, and vigilant patrols on the dangerous roads. This blending of piety and martial skill was unheard of and controversial. Many in the church hierarchy recoiled at the notion of monks who fought with swords. To them, the sacred path was one of peace, contemplation, and humility, not bloodshed. Rumors swirled that these warrior monks might stray into mercenary violence or become tools of political power rather than servants of God. Yet, the knights held fast to their calling. Their greatest champion soon emerged in the figure of Bernard of Clairvaux, a monk whose eloquence and fervor made him one of the most influential men in Europe. Bernard saw in the Templars a new kind of holy warrior, a divine instrument to defend the faith against the growing threat of Islam and to protect the countless pilgrims risking everything to reach the Holy Land. Bernard's support transformed the order's fortunes. In 1129, the Council of Troyes officially recognized the Templars, endorsing their rule and granting them papal protection. This validation was crucial. Not only did it silence many critics, but it opened the gates to patronage from kings and nobles across Europe. Nobles donated lands, castles, and treasure to the order. Wealth flowed in, and with it, power. The Templars' presence grew swiftly. Commanderies fortified estates, serving as both military outposts and centers of administration, sprang up across Europe. These commanderies funded the order's operations in the Holy Land and became vital hubs for recruitment, training, and logistics. Back in Jerusalem, the knights faced daunting challenges. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a precarious foothold amid hostile territory. Every day brought skirmishes, sieges, and political intrigues. The Templars were more than bodyguards for pilgrims. They became frontline warriors defending the fragile Christian states. Yet, their mystique deepened beyond military might. Nestled on the Temple Mount, the very ground beneath their feet was steeped in history and mystery. Some whispered that the Templars had uncovered ancient relics buried deep beneath Solomon's temple, perhaps even the legendary Ark of the Covenant, lost for centuries. Others speculated they held secret knowledge handed down from the builders of the ancient temple. While much of this was likely fantasy, the rumors fed into the order's aura of mystery. The Templars were not just knights, they were guardians of secrets, custodians of a holy legacy wrapped in enigma. Their symbol, the red cross on white mantles, became a beacon to pilgrims and a warning to enemies. They were saints and soldiers, monks and mercenaries, humble brothers and feared warriors. Yet, this potent mix of sanctity and power planted the seeds for future suspicion and envy. Even as the Templars gained favor and strength, their rapid rise stirred unease. Some kings and nobles envied their influence. Some church officials resented their independence. They answered only to the Pope, not local bishops or monarchs. Their vow of poverty belied the growing wealth and landholdings they amassed. This fragile balance between spiritual mission and earthly power would soon be tested in ways no one could have predicted. For now, the Templars stood as sentinels of the Holy Land, living in the shadow of the Holy Sepulchre, the very place where Christ's sacrifice was believed to have taken place. But how long could this warrior monastic order endure the clash of kingdoms, faiths, and ambitions swirling around them? What forces would conspire to elevate them and to destroy them? The warrior monks of Christ. From their humble beginnings guarding pilgrim caravans, the Knights Templar quickly evolved into something far greater, a military powerhouse cloaked in the sanctity of monastic discipline. The transformation was as astonishing as it was unprecedented. Central to their identity was the strict rule that governed their lives, a code combining the rigors of monastic obedience with the demands of a soldier's life. Poverty, chastity, and obedience were not mere ideals, but hard-lived realities. The Templars rejected personal wealth and luxuries, wearing simple white mantles emblazoned with the blood-red cross, symbols of purity and sacrifice. Their day began before dawn with prayers that could last hours, calling upon God's strength and guidance. The chapel echoed with Gregorian chants, the solemn voices of men preparing both body and soul for the battles ahead. Yet, when the morning prayers ended, the knights donned chainmail, grasped sword and shield, and transformed into relentless warriors. Their discipline on the battlefield was ruthless. Tales spread of Templar knights standing firm against overwhelming odds, never retreating unless outnumbered 3-1. They fought with a fierce devotion that inspired awe and terror alike. The Templars' reputation for bravery and steadfastness was matched only by their strict internal order. Infractions were met with harsh discipline. The knights lived communally, eating simple meals, sleeping on bare boards, and submitting to the commands of their superiors without question. Their martial prowess and spiritual zeal caught the attention of one of the most powerful figures in Christendom, Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian monk renowned for his eloquence and devotion. Bernard became the Templars' greatest advocate. In his influential treatise, De Laude Novae Militae, in praise of the new knighthood, Bernard described the Templars as a new kind of Christian knight, clad in white, fighting for God's cause with unwavering courage. He argued that their order was divinely sanctioned, a holy force ordained to defend the Church's interests in the Holy Land. Bernard's support proved decisive. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued the papal bull Omni Datum Optimum, which granted the Templars sweeping privileges. They were exempt from local laws, free from taxes, and answerable only to the Pope himself. This papal endorsement marked a turning point. No longer mere protectors of pilgrims, the Templars became a transnational order with political clout, military might, and vast economic resources. Their independence bred both strength and suspicion. Kings found themselves unable to command the Templars directly, and rival nobles eyed their growing influence with jealousy. Yet, the knights remained loyal to their vows and their spiritual mission. Across Europe, the order expanded rapidly. Commanderies fortified estates serving as recruitment centers, treasuries, and military bases sprouted from England to Spain, France to Italy. These hubs generated wealth and manpower to support campaigns in the Holy Land. Not merely warriors, the Templars became bankers and landowners. Their order managed complex financial transactions, offering pilgrims a safe way to deposit funds in Europe and withdraw them in Jerusalem. A primitive but revolutionary form of international banking. Royal families turned to the Templars for loans, often mortgaging lands or future taxes to finance wars or crusades. Their influence seeped into politics, diplomacy, and commerce, intertwining their fate with the highest powers of medieval Europe. Yet, beneath the gleaming surface lay contradictions. The vow of poverty clashed with the order's enormous wealth. The knights' monastic devotion was balanced precariously with their participation in bloody warfare. Their privileged status sparked envy and conspiracy. Despite these tensions, the Templars flourished. Their white mantles and red crosses became symbols of Christian strength and resilience, a shining order sworn to protect Christendom's holiest sites and ideals. But as their power grew, so too did the dangers they faced, not just from external enemies, but from internal divisions, rival factions, and the shifting tides of political intrigue. How would the Templars navigate the thin line between sanctity and power? Would their sacred mission survive the temptations of wealth and influence? The stage was set for their greatest trials and their most enduring legacy. Blood and sand. The Holy Land was not merely a distant place of pilgrimage. It was a battleground soaked in centuries of faith, blood, and ambition. And into this unforgiving landscape, the Templars marched, swords drawn and prayers on their lips. From their inception, the Knights Templar had been forged for war. Their reason for being was not contemplation or conversion, it was protection through power. Their earliest days saw them escorting fragile bands of pilgrims along the treacherous routes to Jerusalem. But by the mid-12th century, they had become frontline warriors in the age-defining conflict between Christianity and Islam. Their reputation as shock troops was earned through brutal necessity. In battles where defeat meant the loss not just of territory but of entire civilizations, the Templars fought with suicidal resolve. One of their earliest defining moments came at the Siege of Ascalon in 1153, a stronghold held by the Fatimids of Egypt. After months of grueling siege warfare, the Templars defied orders and stormed a breach in the wall, capturing a tower and claiming victory, but at great cost. 40 of their brothers perished, not in battle, but in the political fallout as the Templar commander refused to share the glory with King Baldwin III. Their independence, once their shield, was beginning to draw resentment. Their next trial came in 1177 at the Battle of Montgisard, where a vastly outnumbered Christian force faced the legendary Muslim general Saladin. Jerusalem itself was at risk. The Templars, flanked by King Baldwin IV, just 16 years old and stricken with leprosy, charged into the fray. Against odds estimated at 10-1, the Christians routed Saladin's army. Chroniclers claimed that the Templars' fury and faith turned the tide. Whether legend or truth, the story spread like wildfire, and the Templars' reputation soared. But victories like Montgisard were rare, and Saladin was far from defeated. 10 years later came the Templars' darkest hour, the Battle of Hattin in 1187. In the searing July heat, the combined Christian armies marched across Galilee, thirsty and fatigued, falling into a devastating trap. Saladin encircled them on the horns of Hattin, cut off their water supply, and set brush fires to smoke them out. The Templars, true to their vow, refused to retreat. The battle was a slaughter. Thousands died. The captured knights, including many Templars, were offered a cruel choice: convert to Islam or face execution. Most stood firm. Contemporary accounts describe how Templar captives were beheaded one by one before Saladin himself, each death a grim tribute to their unyielding faith. The fall of Jerusalem followed soon after. For the Templars, it was a spiritual catastrophe. Their purpose to guard the holy city had been annihilated, but they did not vanish. Instead, they regrouped at coastal strongholds like Acre and Tortosa. The fight, they insisted, was not over. Over the next century, the Templars became defenders of Crusader fortresses up and down the Levantine coast. At Acre, they constructed an enormous fortress at the edge of the sea, its walls thick enough to defy catapults, its treasury hidden deep beneath the earth. They held the city for nearly a century, even as one Crusader state after another crumbled around them. At Tortosa, they built impregnable defenses and underground passages stretching to the sea, a lifeline when all else failed. They developed a network of coastal citadels, each one a military node in a fragile chain of Christian resistance. But their once flawless reputation was beginning to show cracks. As losses mounted and the dream of a Christian Holy Land faded, critics began to question the Templars' strategy. Had their rigid military doctrine become obsolete? Did their pride and independence prevent better cooperation with other Crusader forces, including their sometimes rivals, the Hospitallers? Their refusal to retreat, once a noble ideal, was now sometimes seen as a liability, leading to unnecessary deaths. Their wealth and secrecy drew whispers in royal courts and church councils. Even among fellow Christians, the Templars were becoming objects of suspicion. Their black and white worldview, sacred or profane, ally or heretic, left little room for diplomacy, and diplomacy was becoming the preferred weapon of popes and kings alike. Still, the Templars held the line. They fought in the Third Crusade alongside Richard the Lionheart, clashing again with Saladin's forces in pitched battles and dangerous negotiations. They helped negotiate the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192, which granted Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, even as it remained under Muslim control. But each crusade yielded fewer victories and more compromises. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land at all. It ended with the sacking of Christian Constantinople in 1204, deepening the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. By the mid-13th century, the Templars were no longer crusading visionaries. They were custodians of a fading dream. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had been reduced to a scattering of coastal cities. Muslim powers under the Mamluks were rising, stronger, and more unified than ever. Even as they built new castles like the mighty fortress of Atlit, the Templars were defending shadows. In 1291, the shadow vanished. Acre, their final stronghold, fell after a furious siege. Templar knights fought to the last man in their fortress. Some accounts say the treasure vaults were emptied before the fall, their contents spirited away. Others suggest it was buried beneath the burning ruins. With the fall of Acre, the Christian presence in the Holy Land was effectively erased. The Templars returned to Europe, battle-hardened, land-rich, and increasingly out of place. They were warriors without a war. What does a holy army do when the Holy Land is lost? When their enemies are no longer Saracens but kings and popes? That question would define the next and final act of the Templars' strange and storied journey. The temple and the treasury. Long before the modern bank vault, before armored cars and international wire transfers, there was the temple. Not Solomon's, but that of the knights who bore its name. An order that mastered not only the art of war, but the quieter, subtler craft of money. By the early 13th century, the Crusades had slowed. The thunder of swords in the Holy Land had faded, replaced by uneasy truces and diplomatic maneuverings. But the Templars had not grown idle. With Jerusalem lost and battlefields dwindling, they turned their formidable discipline towards something else entirely. Building an empire of stone and silver, they had already laid the foundations. At the height of their power, the Knights Templar owned over 9,000 properties across Europe and the Levant, farms, vineyards, mills, and churches, spread like seeds across the continent. These commanderies weren't merely outposts, they were economic engines. Each produced goods, harvested tithes, and funneled revenue to support the military arm of the order in the East. But the most revolutionary shift was in finance. The Templars invented, or at least perfected, an early form of international banking. A pilgrim preparing to journey to Jerusalem could deposit funds at a Templar house in Paris, receive a coded letter, and then retrieve their money upon arrival in the Holy Land. The system was secure, standardized, and centuries ahead of its time. It wasn't charity. The Templars charged fees and earned interest, though their vow of poverty conveniently excluded the order as a whole. Individual knights lived simply, sleeping in dormitories, wearing coarse robes, and dining in silence, but the order's vaults grew fat. By 1200, the temple in Paris, nicknamed the Treasury of Christendom, held fortunes deposited not just by pilgrims, but by monarchs. Kings began entrusting their wealth to the Templars because their organization was incorruptible, widespread, and immune to local politics. When a crown needed funds moved, secured, or even hidden, it turned to the knights. The Templars became the de facto bankers of Europe. When King John of England quarreled with his barons and the Pope, he stored his treasure with the Templars for safekeeping. When Louis IX of France prepared for the Seventh Crusade, it was the Templars who administered the financial logistics. They didn't just transport coin, they arranged loans, acted as fiscal intermediaries, and sometimes even advised monarchs on economic matters. Their reach wasn't limited to finance. They were builders, master masons who raised stone fortresses across Christendom. From the round churches of London and Tomar to colossal fortifications like Chateau Pellerin in the Levant, the Templars left behind structures that defied time. Their architectural style was functional yet symbolic. Thick walls, circular naves evoking the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and isolated rural compounds designed for both worship and war. They were also bureaucrats. The order's administration was meticulous. Every commandery submitted detailed annual reports. Inventories listed every candle, every bushel of wheat, every coin. Latin clerks, some former monks, ran the paperwork with a precision rivaling any royal court. But with power came suspicion. The secrecy of the Templars, once a virtue, now bred unease. They answered only to the Pope, and their ceremonies, closed to outsiders, became the subject of wild speculation. What did they do behind closed doors? Some whispered of rites involving skulls or sacred kisses or strange idols. Others saw them as proto-masons guarding ancient secrets. Most of it was nonsense. But in an age where rumor could ignite a riot, it was dangerous nonsense. Worse, they were rich, and people noticed. Their holdings stretched from Scotland to Cyprus. Their agricultural estates yielded revenue year after year. Their banking earned interest. Their castles, even in peacetime, loomed with symbolic power. The poor envied them. The nobles resented them. And kings feared them, because a debtor never forgets his creditor. While other military orders like the Hospitallers focused increasingly on care for the sick and wounded, the Templars remained militaristic in identity, yet were increasingly civilian in function. They trained for war but managed treasuries. They pledged chastity and poverty, yet negotiated with emperors. They were caught between two worlds, the monk and the mercenary, the soldier and the scribe. By the late 13th century, that contradiction had grown too large to ignore. The Crusader states were gone. The Holy Land was lost. Yet, the Templars remained armed, organized, and incredibly wealthy. Their martial purpose had faded, but their power had not. Some proposed a solution: a merger. The Pope floated the idea of uniting the Templars with their traditional rivals, the Hospitallers, to form a single military religious order, but both resisted. The Hospitallers feared being overshadowed by the richer Templars. The Templars saw themselves as spiritually distinct. Pride and tradition ran deep, and so they remained a separate entity, independent, wealthy, and increasingly redundant. The treasure they had once protected was no longer Jerusalem's. It was Europe's, and Europe was changing. Nationalism was rising. Monarchs were consolidating power. The papacy itself had grown unstable, manipulated by the ambitions of France and other kingdoms. The age of independent warrior monks had passed, but the Templars did not realize it. Or perhaps they did, and clung all the more tightly to their way of life. In their commanderies, they still trained. In their castles, they still stockpiled supplies. In their treasuries, gold still flowed. But the walls of their invincibility were weakening, not by siege engines, but by politics. They had no armies to fight, no cities to defend, and no place left in the world they had once helped shape. And across the Channel and beyond the Alps, their enemies were no longer infidels in turbans, but men in crowns. One of those men was watching them very closely. A king in debt, a realm in turmoil, a mind that saw opportunity in destruction. And the Templars, they would never see it coming. Enemies in the shadows. Acre fell in the spring of 1291. It was the last major Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. And when it crumbled under the assault of Mamluk forces, it wasn't just stone and mortar that collapsed. It was the very heart of a century-long crusading dream. For the Knights Templar, who had bled and died to defend the cross in the east, the fall of Acre marked a spiritual and strategic catastrophe. With the Holy Land lost, what purpose remained for a warrior monk? The answer was uncertain. The world was changing, and not in their favor. The Templars had long measured their worth by the clamor of battle and the piety of service. But now there were no cities left to reclaim, no caravans to guard through Levantine deserts, no Saracen fortresses to assault. Their castles at Tortosa, Chateau Pellerin, and Gaza were abandoned or lost. The knights who had once stood against the armies of Saladin now found themselves returning to Europe with no war to fight and coffers full of coin. This was the beginning of their end, and they didn't even know it yet. Back in Europe, the Templars were still respected, still feared, and still rich. Their commanderies buzzed with activity, their treasuries overflowed. But their role, once clear and divinely sanctioned, had become vague. Were they monks or soldiers, bankers or relics? And if they were no longer protecting pilgrims in the East, what exactly were they doing? The problem wasn't only existential, it was political. In a fractured Europe teeming with rising monarchs and shifting alliances, power was a delicate thing. The Templars, beholden only to the Pope, were effectively a state within many states. They paid no taxes. They answered to no king. Their castles were autonomous, and their knights, bound by oaths to an international brotherhood, cared little for local politics. To kings struggling with debt, divided nobles, and the burden of war, the Templars were more than suspicious. They were inconvenient. And then there were the rumors, strange ones. Whispers swirled through taverns, monasteries, and courts that the Templars, behind closed doors, practiced bizarre rites, that new initiates were forced to spit on the cross, to kiss one another in shameful places, to swear loyalty not just to Christ, but to strange idols. An image, they said, of a bearded head. Some called it Baphomet, which they kept and worshipped in secret. There was no evidence, of course, but in the medieval world, evidence was less important than the whisper that preceded it, and the Templars, with their sealed ceremonies and cult-like loyalty, made perfect targets for suspicion. Fueling this was their fierce secrecy. Unlike other monastic orders, the Templars permitted no outsiders into their rituals. Their induction ceremonies were closed, their records coded. Their commanderies operated like miniature fortresses, guarded and veiled in mystique. That veil, once part of their mystique, had become a shroud. Other orders grew wary. The Hospitallers, the Templars' traditional rivals, had pivoted successfully to medical care and charitable work. They were increasingly seen as useful, grounded, and humble. The Templars, aloof, armored, and distant. When Pope Clement V proposed uniting the two orders into one, ostensibly to focus Christian resources more effectively, both groups resisted. But it was the Templars who appeared the most obstinate. Their refusal, cloaked in talk of tradition and purity, smelled more like pride. Behind the scenes, deeper suspicions festered. Some theorized the Templars had never stopped their crusade, but had turned inward, hoarding relics, documents, and secrets, that they were guarding something, some truth too dangerous to reveal. Others believed they had amassed a hidden treasury, possibly spirited away from Acre before the fall. Gold, jewels, sacred relics, the very wealth of Christendom now buried or dispersed in France. These suspicions found fertile ground. King Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, was watching carefully. He had fought costly wars with England and Flanders. He had taxed the church. He had even arrested the Pope's envoy. And through it all, one fact remained. Philip was desperately in debt to the Templars. They had financed his wars. They held his treasury. Their headquarters in Paris, massive, stone-clad, and secure, stood just a few blocks from his palace, a constant reminder of their power and his dependence. Philip did not trust them, and worse, he feared them. The rumors were useful. An accusation of heresy in medieval Europe was not just damning, it was annihilating. If Philip could paint the Templars not as noble warriors, but as apostates, sodomites, and devil worshippers, he wouldn't just destroy them. He could confiscate their wealth with the blessing of the church. But he needed more than rumor, he needed timing. And the Pope, Clement V, was a cautious, pliable man. Installed under French influence, Clement was caught between his loyalty to the papacy and his obligation to the French crown. If Philip could apply just enough pressure, just the right accusations, then the Templars' carefully constructed world might collapse like a house of cards. And so the stage was set. The Templars, unaware, continued their routines. They held councils, they trained squires, they processed ledgers and fortified estates. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, a seasoned knight, even corresponded with the Pope, urging a new crusade. They still believed they were untouchable, but the storm was gathering, and as October of 1307 approached, shadows lengthened across the temple. They would wake one Friday morning to a knock at the gate, and a betrayal so total, so precise, that even the strongest fortress could not withstand it. The King's Gambit. The sun had barely risen on Friday, October 13th, 1307, when the trap was sprung. Across the breadth of France, in towns and cities, castles and villages, agents of the king moved with ruthless precision. Doors were battered down, knights were dragged from their beds, scrolls and ledgers seized, armories and vaults locked and sealed. By dusk, over 600 Templars, men of rank and common brothers alike, were in chains. The charge: heresy. King Philip IV, the calculating monarch, who had once knelt before Templar altars, now declared them apostates and enemies of God. The irony was chilling and deliberate. Philip wasn't just staging a legal purge. He was launching one of the most brutal political takeovers in medieval history, under the guise of holy justice. But it hadn't been done overnight. Philip had prepared for months. Secret letters had been written weeks in advance, sealed with royal authority, and distributed to bailiffs and sheriffs across the kingdom, each with strict instructions not to open them until the appointed morning. He needed the arrests to happen simultaneously before news could spread, before the Templars could flee or fight. It worked. Even the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was caught unaware. De Molay had just returned from Poitiers, where he had met with Pope Clement, ironically, to address rumors and defend the order's integrity. He had no inkling that within days he'd be shackled in a dungeon, interrogated, and forced to confess to sins he had never imagined. Philip's accusations were grotesque: denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, kissing of the base of the spine, and other obscene parts during initiation, worship of a mysterious head, and idolatry. The most scandalous, that the Templars had secretly renounced Christ and practiced Islamic rites, an echo of the very enemy they had fought for generations. These weren't just charges, they were weapons. The king understood the psychology of fear. In a world where salvation was everything and damnation eternal, heresy wasn't just a crime, it was contagion. One accusation could stain an entire community. And so, under torture, the confessions flowed. The rack, the strappado, thumbs crushed, feet burned, teeth pulled, bones broken. In pain, men will say anything. Brother after brother confessed to outlandish crimes. Some contradicted each other. Some recanted. Others begged to confess just to stop the agony. The irony was sickening. These were men trained to endure hardship, to fight to the death, to resist Saracen blades and desert heat, now broken in their own homeland, not by enemies of Christ, but by his supposed defender. The Pope, at first, was stunned. Clement V had never wanted this. Though a Frenchman and under Philip's influence, he had hesitated to act against the Templars. He had promised an investigation, not a massacre. But Philip's sudden move changed the landscape. The sheer scale of the arrests, the flow of confessions, and the public outcry forced Clement's hand. He ordered his own inquiry, but by then the damage was done. In France, the narrative had been set. Templars were no longer heroes, they were heretics. The same men who had once protected relics in Jerusalem were now accused of spitting on the cross. The public, already uneasy with their wealth and secrecy, turned against them. Church bells that once rang in their honor now tolled for their damnation. Other kingdoms watched with unease. In England, Edward II hesitated, skeptical of the charges. In Portugal, Dinis I was reluctant to persecute an order that had served him loyally. In Aragon and Castile, the process was slower, more cautious, but the pressure from France and the papacy was immense. Soon, interrogations spread across Europe. The papal bulls, official letters from Clement, demanded that other rulers detain and examine Templars within their realms. While some were lenient, others followed France's example. But nowhere was the operation as brutal or as orchestrated as in Philip's France. Because for Philip, this was never just about heresy. It was about money. The Templars had lent him vast sums, funds used to wage war, manage the kingdom, and pay bribes. By arresting them, Philip not only wiped out his debt, he also gained access to Templar lands, treasures, and infrastructure. The famed temple in Paris, once a fortress of financial power, was now his vault, and still he hungered for more. He demanded that the order be dissolved and its wealth transferred to the crown, but the church resisted. According to canon law, only the Pope could suppress a religious order, and so began a delicate, brutal dance, part politics, part theology, all laced with fear. To strengthen his case, Philip pushed further. He had public confessions, read aloud in churches. He paraded Templars through the streets, broken and humiliated. He pressured nobles, bishops, and even jurists to support his claims. And he planted the seed. If the church didn't act, was it complicit? By 1308, the situation reached a boiling point. Jacques de Molay, once proud and stoic, now languished in chains. Though he had confessed under torture, he later retracted his words, claiming his confession was forced and that the order was innocent. Other knights did the same, but retraction was often a death sentence. Pope Clement wavered. He didn't want to destroy the Templars, but he also feared a rift with France. After months of negotiation, threats, and behind-the-scenes coercion, he summoned a council. It would be in Vienne, in southern France, and there, under enormous political pressure, the fate of the Knights Templar would be sealed. But for now, in 1307, the game was still in play. Philip had struck first, and blood had been drawn. But the order, though battered, was not yet extinguished. In monasteries, whispers of injustice spread. In castles, nobles questioned the king's motives. And in dungeons across France, the brothers of the Temple endured, hoping futilely that truth might yet prevail. The trials of the Temple, the wheels of medieval justice, turned slowly, but once in motion, they ground men into dust. By early 1308, the Knights Templar were no longer a military order. They were prisoners, suspects, and, in the eyes of many, already guilty. Yet, the Church had not officially condemned them. That final act would require more than arrests and torture. It would require a legal and spiritual reckoning. Pope Clement V, now caught between the hammer of King Philip IV and the anvil of canon law, sought to bring order to the chaos. He announced that the Church, not secular kings, would judge the Templars. The investigations would be thorough, canonical, and above all, just. But in practice, that promise was hollow, because the Church's hands were no longer clean. They were stained with political fear and royal pressure. The Pope established commissions to interrogate Templars throughout Europe. In France, England, Italy, Spain, and Germany, clerics summoned accused brothers, read them the charges, and demanded confessions. Some of these tribunals acted with a degree of fairness. Others echoed the violence of France, with interrogation methods that blurred the line between questioning and cruelty. The heart of it all, however, remained Paris, where the greatest number of Templars languished in cells that stank of mold and misery. There, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay and other high-ranking officers Geoffroy de Charnay, Hugues de Parot, and Geoffroy de Gonneville faced the Church's appointed inquisitors. These men, once commanders of armies and keepers of secrets, were now gaunt shadows of themselves. Months of isolation, deprivation, and torture had taken their toll. Molay, under duress, confessed to spitting on the cross during initiation, an admission he later retracted. Others offered similar accounts, admitting to strange rituals, denials of Christ, or obscene kisses. But their confessions were riddled with contradictions. One brother claimed the order worshipped a black cat. Another swore he had seen a mysterious head with glowing eyes. Yet another insisted there were secret words passed between knights to bind them in unholy pacts. Were these lies, hallucinations, or simply the broken testimonies of men who would say anything to stop the torment? Some bishops began to doubt. In England, clerics found little to substantiate the charges. There, the Templars were interrogated with less brutality. Many denied the accusations outright. Some admitted to minor faults: pride, lack of observance of rules, but nothing like the heresies alleged in France. In Aragon, James II expressed skepticism. He asked for evidence before launching any mass arrests. In Portugal, King Dinis I refused to condemn the Templars outright and instead sought a compromise. The cracks in the narrative began to show. And yet Philip pressed on. He reminded Clement that the Templars had confessed, that they had admitted to vile things, that delay in judgment was dangerous. It might invite divine wrath or embolden real heretics. He pushed for an endgame, the dissolution of the order. But the Pope needed something more, a council. And so, in 1311, he summoned the Council of Vienne, a major ecclesiastical gathering to decide the fate of the Templars. Bishops, cardinals, and abbots assembled, cloaked in red and gold, bringing with them documents, transcripts, and years of whispered suspicion. There was debate. Some clerics argued the order had become corrupt and obsolete. Others said the evidence was flimsy, the confessions tainted. Still, others feared the precedent. If one papal order could be destroyed under political pressure, what next? The Dominicans? The Hospitallers? But while the Church debated, Philip took matters into his own hands once again. In a shocking display of theatrical manipulation, he arrived in Vienne with an armed escort. His message was clear. The council could debate all it wanted, but its conclusion was already written. And so, in 1312, under duress, Pope Clement V issued the Bull Vox in Excelso, formally dissolving the Knights Templar. Not because they were found guilty, but because, as Clement wrote, their reputation had been so blackened, their presence caused scandal and offense to the faithful. It was a verdict based not on truth but on perception. The Templars' properties were, in theory, to be transferred to the Hospitallers, another military order. But in practice, much of the wealth vanished, seized by kings, nobles, and opportunists. In France, Philip ensured that a good portion stayed in his own treasury. As for the knights, some were released and allowed to live in monastic obscurity. Others were absorbed into other orders. Many simply disappeared, fading into the towns and country of Europe, forgotten and impoverished. But a few were not so lucky. In Paris, 4 of the highest-ranking Templars, including Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay, were sentenced to life imprisonment. Yet even here, the story refused to end cleanly, because something remarkable happened. In March 1314, as they were brought before a public tribunal to confirm their sentences, Molay and Charnay stood up and denounced everything. They retracted their confessions loudly, defiantly, in front of a stunned crowd. They swore the order was innocent, that their admissions had been false, that they would rather die than bear false witness. The response was swift and savage. Philip ordered them burned alive that very evening. No appeal, no delay, no final mass. A wooden pyre was erected on the Ile de la Cité in the middle of the Seine. As the flames rose, Molay did not cry out for mercy. Instead, he allegedly shouted that Philip and Clement would soon face God's judgment. It was a moment that would echo through history, for within the year, both the Pope and the King were dead. Ashes and echoes. The flames that consumed Jacques de Molay on that March evening in 1314 were meant to be the final act, a brutal punctuation mark on the end of the Knights Templar. But fire has a way of spreading, especially when it feeds not only on wood and flesh, but on legend. As the pyre crackled on the Ile de la Cité, a chilling silence fell over the watching crowd. Many had come expecting a public shaming, perhaps a broken old man pleading for mercy. Instead, they witnessed defiance. With smoke curling around him and death moments away, Molay lifted his voice. His words, as reported by several chroniclers, rang like a curse. God knows who is wrong and has sinned. A calamity will soon befall those who have condemned us. Before the year is out, I summon you, Pope Clement, and you, King Philip, to appear before God's tribunal. The fire roared, and the Grand Master of the Templars was gone. To a medieval audience, such words were more than dramatic, they were prophetic. And when Pope Clement V died just a month later, followed by Philip IV 7 months after that, rumors exploded across Christendom. Whispers of a Templar curse spread like wildfire. Some said the Grand Master's soul had reached heaven and issued divine judgment. Others believed Satan himself had taken vengeance, but all agreed something had been set in motion. That night, a shadow had passed over the thrones of Europe, and the deaths didn't stop. Within 14 years, all of Philip IV's sons, who ruled in rapid succession, died without male heirs. The Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for centuries, came to an abrupt end. Civil unrest followed. The Hundred Years' War erupted soon after. Many blamed it on the Templar curse, a spiritual rot seeded by injustice. But legends rarely stop at vengeance. They reach for the fantastical. One tale claimed that 4 knights had escaped Paris the night before the mass arrests in 1307, taking with them the Templar treasure, the famed riches of the order, rumored to be buried beneath the temple in Jerusalem or hidden in secret vaults. But no gold was ever found. The official inventories seized by Philip's men listed items of value: lands, reliquaries, livestock, armor, but nowhere was there a hoard that matched the whispered scale. Crates of jewels, chests of silver, sacred relics. Yet the absence of evidence only made the treasure more alluring. Theories multiplied. Some believed the Templars had smuggled their wealth to Scotland, where the church's power was weaker and exile more feasible. There they supposedly merged with local nobility or protected the fledgling Freemason guilds, which would later inherit their secrets. Others told of underground tunnels beneath Paris and La Rochelle, where Templar ships waited in darkness, bearing treasure and knights to safer shores. Portugal, friendly to the order, was a favorite destination. There, the Templars were reorganized as the Order of Christ with papal approval, some say, as a way to quietly preserve them. And then came the ultimate twist: the idea that the Templars had never truly vanished. In southern France, legends grew of knights in white mantles guarding ancient secrets. In Switzerland, some said the banking system had roots in Templar ingenuity. In Scotland, stories linked them to Rosslyn Chapel, a place dense with esoteric carvings and geometric mystery. But what of the treasure? According to certain fringe theories, it was never gold or silver at all. Some claimed it was the Holy Grail, not a cup, but a bloodline. That the Templars had discovered truths too dangerous for church or king. That they preserved secrets from ancient Jerusalem scrolls, artifacts, proof that could upend the very foundations of Christendom. And perhaps that was their real sin. Not heresy, but knowledge. One story in particular gained traction centuries later, that the Templars had found something beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, something older than Christianity. Some even dared to name it the Ark of the Covenant, the source of divine power described in the Old Testament. Whether relic or rumor, these tales formed the backbone of Templar mythos in the centuries that followed. But what truly elevated the Templars from fallen knights to eternal symbols of secrecy was the day of their arrest itself, Friday, October 13th, 1307. It had been a normal day until that morning when Philip's men stormed priories and castles across France. The idea that a single day could hold such doom took root. By the 20th century, Friday the 13th was widely seen as unlucky, a superstition that persists today. Some historians argue this connection is a modern fabrication, but folklore doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about resonance, and few images are more potent than that of a brotherhood betrayed and burned under the black banner of political expedience. In the ashes of that betrayal, a story was born that refused to die. It flickered in Enlightenment salons where philosophers debated secret knowledge and esoteric orders. It flared in 19th century Romanticism, which painted the Templars as tragic heroes. It burned brightly again in Dan Brown's novels, where ancient conspiracies and codes brought the medieval order into modern thrillers. But strip away the fiction and a darker truth remains. The Templars were men, flawed, ambitious, devout, and sometimes ruthless. They built an empire of faith and finance, and when the winds shifted, they fell like Icarus, undone by their proximity to power. Still, even now, every time someone clutches a charm on Friday the 13th, walks into Rosslyn Chapel, or whispers about hidden gold beneath Oak Island, they unknowingly echo the final cry of Jacques de Molay, a man whose voice still rises from the flames. Legacy of shadows. History has an odd habit. It buries the dead, but not their legends. After the flames that consumed Jacques de Molay died down, one might expect the world to move on. The Order of the Knights Templar was officially dissolved, their lands confiscated, their leadership executed or imprisoned. But the truth is, the story didn't end. It simply stepped into the shadows. Some Templars disappeared, literally. While many knights were arrested in France, the coordinated sweep failed in several regions. In England, arrests were delayed. In Germany and Spain, resistance to Philip's influence meant that some Templars were never even tried. Portugal, under King Dinis I, took a different approach. Instead of condemning the order, he simply renamed it. By 1319, Pope John XXIII approved the Order of Christ, allowing former Templars to continue their work under a new name. Far from being punished, they became central to Portuguese exploration efforts, sponsoring voyages that would launch the Age of Discovery. It was a quiet continuation, a rebirth cloaked in legitimacy, but whispers persisted. One popular theory claims that a group of Templars escaped to Scotland, seeking refuge with Robert the Bruce, a king excommunicated by the Pope and thus beyond papal law. The story goes that Templar knights fought alongside Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, tipping the scales in favor of the Scots. While concrete proof is lacking, these legends endure. In Rosslyn Chapel, a Gothic marvel built in the 15th century by the Sinclair family, carvings show knightly figures, strange flora, and symbols that don't quite fit. Some claim these are Templar fingerprints, evidence of a secret lineage passed down through generations. Others take the tale further. By the 18th century, Freemasonry had emerged as a powerful and mysterious fraternal order with rituals, symbols, and an air of secrecy. Parallels to the Templars seemed obvious. Several Masonic rites, especially the Scottish Rite, explicitly reference the Knights Templar. Some lodges even claim direct descent. The idea is tantalizing, that the Freemasons didn't just borrow from the Templars, but are the Templars, surviving in plain sight under new names and robes. But is it true? Historically, no clear line connects the medieval order to the Enlightenment-era Masons. Most scholars believe the connection was invented in the 18th century as a way to lend grandeur and mystique to Masonic rites. Still, for many members and conspiracy theorists alike, the belief remains powerful, and it doesn't stop there. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Templars were reborn once again, this time in literature and occult circles. The Rosicrucians, a semi-mystical movement claiming secret wisdom from ancient times, wove the Templars into their origin myths. So too did various Neo-Templar groups across Europe, some of which still exist today, holding ceremonies that blend medieval homage with esoteric symbolism. Then came the Holy Grail. The idea that the Templars were guardians of sacred relics didn't begin with Dan Brown, but he certainly poured fuel on the fire. In his novel, The Da Vinci Code, the Templars are linked to the bloodline of Christ, the Priory of Sion, and a chain of secrets stretching from the Last Supper to modern-day Paris. Before him, Michael Begant, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln published Holy Blood, Holy Grail in 1982, a pseudo-historical work that claimed the Templars found documents beneath the Temple Mount, proving that Jesus fathered children. According to their theory, the Church moved swiftly to suppress this, and the Templars paid the price. No serious historian accepts this, but as storytelling, it's irresistible. And what about other relics? Some claim the Shroud of Turin, said to bear the image of Christ, passed through Templar hands. Others believe they found the Ark of the Covenant, or at least knowledge of its whereabouts. The notion that the Templars unearthed ancient, dangerous wisdom beneath Jerusalem is a recurring theme from Indiana Jones to Assassin's Creed. In popular culture, the Templars have become shorthand for mystery. They are the men behind the curtain, the silent guardians, or the hidden manipulators, depending on the storyteller. In one version, they're noble defenders of truth. In another, they're puppet masters pulling the strings of nations. And that's the curious power of the Templar myth, malleability. Because the historical record is sparse, fragmented by trials, torture, and destruction, The gaps are filled with imagination. It's like a canvas with just enough lines drawn to suggest a grand design, but never enough to know what it truly was. To some, this is troubling. To others, it's magic. Even today, new orders bearing the Templar names spring up across the world. Some are Christian charities, others are cosplay societies. A few claim actual descent from medieval lines, usually without much proof. What is certain is that the symbol of the Red Cross on white, the image of the knight on horseback, still commands awe. And the date Friday the 13th still carries a shiver of fear. We remember the Templars not because we know them, but because we don't. Their blend of spirituality and violence, mysticism and bureaucracy, heroism and hubris, it speaks to the contradictions in us all. They were holy warriors who became bankers. They served both God and gold. They were praised as saints, then crushed as sinners. In the end, they may be less a historical institution than a mirror, reflecting back whatever we choose to believe, whether that's secret relics, ancient bloodlines, or the simple truth that power never comes without a price. The eternal brotherhood. So, who were the Knights Templar really? Were they humble protectors of pilgrims, martyrs to greed and politics, or something altogether more complicated, an enigma forged in steel and sealed in secrecy? Over nearly 2 centuries, they transformed from a modest band of warrior monks into one of the most powerful, feared, and mysterious institutions in medieval Christendom. They were born in the dust of the Holy Land, nurtured by faith and armored by purpose. Their rise was meteoric, backed by kings, blessed by popes, and feared by enemies. But their fall, it was sudden, brutal, and irreversible. They became too rich, too autonomous, too inconvenient. And in a world where thrones were fragile and papal politics ruthless, that made them a target, whether guilty or innocent. The Templars were ultimately victims of their own success, trapped in a web of royal debt, public suspicion, and ecclesiastical fear. Their downfall wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. And yet, they never truly vanished. Their legacy is etched not just in stone fortresses or ancient ledgers, but in the imagination of the world. They live on in books and movies, in secret handshakes and whispered conspiracies. Their name is invoked by modern-day orders, fictional cults, and amateur historians alike. Perhaps that is the greatest testament to their enduring myth. While their bodies may have turned to ash, the idea of the Templars became immortal, because buried in their story is something eternal. It speaks to our deepest curiosities about the nature of power, the limits of faith, and the price of truth, about how ideals can be both shield and sword, and how even the most righteous can fall in the end. Maybe it doesn't matter whether they hid the Holy Grail or carried the Ark of the Covenant. What matters is why we keep asking. What draws us back to their tale again and again is not just the history, but the mystery. And that's what exploring secret histories is all about. Not just the dates and names, but the deeper questions, the echoes that linger, the shadows that stretch. We encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Were the Templars holy warriors or hidden heretics? If you found this journey through flame and legend engaging, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more historical explorations, and sharing it with others who seek forgotten truths. The past is never truly past, and some stories refuse to stay buried.